am so happy to introduce Ron Unger as our next speaker. Ron is a licensed clinical social worker, therapist, and consultant, specializing in CBT and related approaches for psychosis. For the past 2 decades, he has been providing seminars on therapy for psychosis, working with the intersection of trauma and psychosis, and addressing cultural and spiritual issues within treatment for psychosis at universities and mental health facilities across the United States and internationally. His teaching aims to inspire and guide people to relate to the essential humanity in otherwise puzzling extreme states of mind, and to reveal possible pathways people can take towards recovery and healing. He chairs the Pacific Northwest branch of the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis in the US, and maintains a blog at recoveryfrompsychosis.org. For our next presentation, Ron will share how treatment is different when we conceptualize psychosis as primarily a disturbance in relationships. He asks us to explore what's possible when working from this humanistic paradigm. Ron, it's wonderful to have you here to share your presentation, Trauma, Psychosis, and Problems in Relationship, Exploring the Connections. Ron, you can go ahead and share your screen, and I just want to personally say I'm just so happy you're here. So the floor is yours.
Okay, yeah, it's an honor to be here and talk about that role of human connection and within attempts to help people who are struggling with what we call psychosis. Before I talk about what helps form those good connections, I'd like to talk about one big thing that I think often gets in the way of forming those kind of human connections, and we might say it haunts the whole field of mental health. And that's the idea. That's the idea that we can know for certain what's wrong with the people that we're trying to help. I mean, we often notice how rigidly people diagnosed with psychosis hold beliefs, and we see that as a problem, rightfully, but we fail to notice how professionals often do something similar. You know, like when we think that we can know what's going on with people by putting them in diagnostic categories. Now, I don't want to pick on psychiatrists because they aren't the only ones that do this, but they are kind of on top of the mental health system, so they're most notorious for it. So, like, one story I heard was this guy that went to visit a mental hospital, and he came back and he told his friend, "Well, that was a very strange experience." And his friend said, "Well, why?" "Well, the first person I talked to thought that they were God." And he said, "Oh, you started talking with one of the patients?" And it was like, no, that was the psychiatrist. And a related story is kind of like, what's the difference between a psychiatrist and God? Well, at least God knows that he's not a psychiatrist. So that's the idea that this craving to be certain and is a very human thing. And when people are distressed, they often want somebody to be certain. So often we get the sense that we're supposed to be telling people what's going on, that we know what's going on. And especially when we feel threatened, we want to feel certain. We want to feel like, hey, we're encountering this person who seems to be in a completely different world. I've got to make sense of this. I've got to show that I'm sane. But the problem is that trying to be certain shuts down our curiosity. And without curiosity, we're really mostly useless in helping people. So I like this quote by Emerson, where he said, "People wish to be settled, but only as far as they are unsettled is there any hope for them." It's because, like, when we're certain about our views, we tend to either confront people whose views are different, or we evade direct conversation with them about our differences. And confrontation really doesn't work, because research has shown that even with people that don't have psychosis, if you confront people about their strongly held beliefs, they tend to dig in. They've even done brain studies on that. And the reason and logic areas of the brain kind of shut down, and fight or flight gets activated when you confront strongly held beliefs. And then, of course, if you do the opposite, where you avoid, talking to people or showing any different point of view, then and you just don't talk to them about it, then you're avoiding connecting with them around the things that really are their concerns, what really is concerning them in their lives. And a lot of mental health workers have done that, just like don't talk to people about their delusions, for example. Makes it harder to connect. David Bohm is quoted as saying that real dialogue is where two or more people become willing to suspend their certainty in each other's presence. And if we want the person with psychosis to let go of their claims to certainty and engage in real dialogue with us, we might have to let go of our own claims to certainty. And then we can have collaborative explorations that aren't confrontational, but can be deeply engaging. Russell Wazeek is a psychiatrist in the UK, and he points out that reality is often not black and white. And we're all caught up in misjudgments of various kinds about reality. And so it really doesn't work to come to people with an attitude of like, hey, I'm sane and you're not. It's a much better approach is just to come with the attitude of, hey, how can I help? I'm a human. Maybe I can help you. Now, not only just trying to be certain get in the way of authentic human relationship, but sometimes we can get caught up being certain about stuff that doesn't even make sense if we step back and reflect on it. And one of those is when we confuse diagnosis or putting somebody in a category, we confuse that with understanding the person or knowing what's causing their difficulties. So this slide kind of tries to illustrate that. Somebody might come to us, like what's causing these weird experiences I'm having. And we might say, hey, they're caused by your illness, which is schizophrenia. But then if the person kind of asks us, well, how do you know that I have an illness called schizophrenia? The only thing we can really answer is, well, we can diagnose you with schizophrenia because you have these weird experiences. There's a certain circularity there. It's not telling us anything. We could use the same logic to say that a demon is causing it. How do you know I have a demon? Well, you do because you're having these experiences. And some people have pointed out that the fact that professionals use this kind of reasoning shows that they suffer from circular reasoning disorder, and that's what causes it. But this kind of circular reasoning isn't just silly. It leads to an absence of curiosity about what's really going on with people, because it creates an illusion that we do know something or, even are certain about something, when in fact, maybe we know very little. And again, being curious about people is something we really need to have if we're going to have authentic relations with them. Now you might think some of you might think I'm being unfair here. Maybe we really do have evidence that there being a biological and problem in the brain that leads to what we call schizophrenia. And schizophrenia can be understood as a name for that brain problem. So it really does say something. But in talking about that notion, I'm going to borrow a couple of slides from a presentation by Eleanor Longden that she did once at an earlier conference for this organization. But they make a really important point, and I think that's worth review, even if you've already seen them. So there is real evidence that at least often, on average, but not always, people diagnosed with schizophrenia have brain differences compared with the average non-diagnosed person. And this is often cited as proof that the problem is all in the brain. But John Reed is a researcher I know who finds that argument unconvincing. And he will show up sometimes at conferences where people are making that argument. And he likes to raise his hand and ask an innocent question. He'll raise his hand and say, excuse me, but what are brains for? And then the answer, of course, comes out that, well, brains are for relating and responding to our environment. And he'll then point out, well, if that's what they're meant to do, then maybe when they're functioning as they're supposed to, they're supposed to become different in response to different environments. And that's important because, as you see on this very similar slide, The same commonly found, the same brain differences that have been cited as proof that schizophrenia is a brain disorder are also commonly found in the brains of those who've been abused as children. So that commonality suggests that maybe the problem didn't start in the brain. It's not really a brain disorder, but there were problems in the person's world. And then the brain attempted to adapt to those situations and experiences by developing these things that are more unusual. And that suggests also that it's possible if the person has more healing experiences, the brain might change again. And there are some studies that show that what seem to be positive changes when people respond well to therapy for psychosis. So I definitely don't want to come across as someone certain that there are never biological or physical contributing causes to psychosis, because those sorts of problems are possible and proven in some cases. But what I do want everyone in the field to consider that for many people, the real problem is traumatic and stressful experiences. So let me just kind of quickly review the evidence that trauma is commonly a cause for psychosis. Now, I'm actually at a conference in Helsinki right now in Finland with ISPS, the International Society for Psychological and Social Approaches to Psychosis. But somebody was presenting on trauma and psychosis today, and they were making the point that 15 years ago, this kind of thing was very rarely talked about, and now there's really just tons of evidence out there. But this is just a quick review of it. So one of the ways they look at it is they look at people that they know have been traumatized, and then they follow them over time and see, well, how common is it for people to develop psychotic symptoms? And it's actually very common. So another way is looking at it the opposite of that. What about if you start with people who have psychotic symptoms and see how likely they are to report trauma histories? And it turns out that's also very high. And you might think, well, maybe people with psychosis just report, trauma when there wasn't trauma. But in fact, when they look for how often is this corroborated, it seems to be corroborated about as commonly as it is with people that don't have psychosis. Now, it's also true that sometimes people with psychosis report traumas that haven't really happened, at least not in our reality. But so it does get a little complex. But anyway, there is some validity to this evidence. And then another thing is, this is really important, studies that show that greater the severity of the trauma, the greater likelihood of more and more intense psychotic symptoms. And pretty much almost all of the studies that look for this that have found it, and sometimes very strongly. One study found that for people that had all 5 of the different types of trauma that they were looking for, that those people were 193 times more likely to have some kind of psychotic symptoms. And this evidence has been as strong as the evidence that smoking causes lung cancer. It's on that kind of level of strength. Now, then, like those other slides just pointed out, brain changes sometimes linked with psychotic symptoms in schizophrenia are also found disproportionately in children who've been abused. And then finally, there's often just logical and meaningful connections between psychotic symptoms and normal reactions to traumatic experiences. Often the person will hear a voice that sounds like the voice of their perpetrator. Or it follows a lot of the same dynamic as there is in post-traumatic stress disorder, but often it's a bit disguised, so it gets a little tricky. But anyway, these are all the reasons to think that trauma can cause psychotic symptoms, and it's really important to take into consideration. Now, the question of how exactly trauma leads to psychosis is a pretty big question. We don't really have time to explore it today, and we don't have anything close to all the answers. But I think a helpful broad idea is that trauma disturbs people's relationships, and that's their relationships both with other people and between themselves and other parts of themselves, parts of their own mind. And when these disturbances reach a certain point of confusion, we see the problems that we diagnose as psychosis. Um, and I think this idea is really important, what we're talking about at this conference, because if trauma is a disturbance in a person's relationships, then maybe if we ourselves work at relating to someone in a really healthy human way and forming that kind of relationship, we can help provide a foundation for the person to get back to healthy relationships with other people and also with themselves. And so to kind of undo the damage. I should also mention that while trauma and people's reactions to trauma are often definitely things that can mess up people's relationships, there are many other kinds of factors that can also be part of someone's story of how their relationships get disturbed. And often things that are stressors that are less extreme than what we call trauma can really throw us off, and both life and our brains are very tricky. And then there can be long-term corrosive factors in people's life, not like a quick disturbing trauma, but things like exposure to racism or transphobia or just economic oppression. And then things people do to cope, like maybe they cope by social withdrawal, or maybe they cope by drug use. Often people do things to cope in the short run makes them do better, but in the long run makes them do worse. The key idea is that everybody has their story. And I think relating to someone as a full human being requires being curious about their story, what led them to feel and act as they do, rather than just assuming or being certain that there must be an illness that makes them that way. Because if there's a story to how their problems developed, then there might be a story to how they get better. And we can work on creating that kind of story with people. So I want to look for just a little bit at how trauma specifically can cause problems in people's relationships, disturbs relationships with other people. Research shows that traumatic events do much of their harm by undermining people's valued social identities. For example, rape is seen as an effective weapon of war because it often shames the victims and weakens their bonds and weakens, their family and their community. Sexual abuse of all kinds has a similar effect on people. Interpersonal violence and abuse also weakens social trust, which is necessary to maintain social bonds and social identity. And it's worse, of course, when people are shamed to the degree they can't even talk about what happened. And then as the person gets caught up in reacting to the horrible things that have been done to them, they can become ashamed of their own reactions. They're ashamed of their own reactions to trauma. And then all of that fear, shame, and disconnection can lead to the reactions we call psychosis. And then people can get further, shamed and disconnected as a result of that. And also as a result of the way people respond to psychosis can cause more trauma and shame. Like often when people become psychotic, others withdraw from them, or they're more likely to do things like apply force of various kinds that can be traumatizing. And all this can create more shame and disconnection. So you can get in a lot of vicious circles. Now, on the other hand, when social identity can be maintained despite the trauma, or when social identity can be restored afterward, then you see a lot more resilience. Now, one interesting fact is that amongst torture survivors, the torture survivors that were committed activists tended to have significantly less post-traumatic symptoms compared to, let's say, people that were caught up in torture, even though they weren't really activists. The activists often had more severe torture because they knew those people were, part of the activist group. Was the non-activists, though, had a lot more PTSD. And why is that? Well, for the activists, enduring torture had a lot more meaning because it affirmed their belonging in their social group. I'm the activist. I have a purpose here, and I'm undergoing torture to, fight for my purpose. Whereas it didn't have that sense of meaning or that sense of social bond for the people that weren't activists. So one of the on the other hand, when we see people caught up in psychosis, they're often really become very disconnected from their social groups. And in fact, one of the features of psychosis is people are figuring out reality completely on their own, just relying too much on their own experience, and they're not thinking about, well, how do others look at this and that sort of thing. Um, and and some might think of that, well, that's maybe just because they've got something wrong with their brain. But it really makes sense if you consider how trauma makes people feel different from everybody else. Now, some of my clients talk about feeling like not really human, often because they weren't treated like a human. Ray Waddingham, who maybe some of you know as a leader in the Hearing Voices movement, she reported that being abused led her to feel that she was an alien or had an alien inside her. And that sense gradually got stronger in her through her teens and eventually led to her psychosis. Now, I'm also somebody who grew up experiencing a lot of child abuse and bullying. And one of the hardest things for me to overcome was a sense of a huge gap between me and other people, the sense that I was just like deeply or fundamentally different than everyone else. And that sense of a gap made it easier for me to go into some degree of psychosis as a young person. Anyway, if we can find a way to connect with people experiencing psychosis in a way that emphasizes our common humanity and our uncertainty, then we can possibly help people move towards re-engaging in the process of making sense and coordination with others, rather than, people developing their sense of reality completely independently, and also differently than having one sense of reality imposed on themselves by experts. In the long run, it's crucial that we we help people regain their confidence that they can participate in making meaning together with others. They have something to contribute, but they can also accept contributions from others, and it becomes a collaborative effort. So when we do that in our relationships with them, then we're eventually helping them go beyond just connecting with us and helping them restore connections with a peer group, which is really crucial for trauma recovery. People need to connect with others who are a cultural fit for them. So it might mean repairing connections with their former group, and it might mean finding new groups that match their emerging identity. But now I'm going to get into talking about paralleling the disturbance in interpersonal relationships. There's a disturbance in intrapersonal relationships, or people's relationships with parts of themselves that comes with trauma, and then sometimes more extensively with psychosis. And to understand how that works, we can start by thinking about the difference between how we process things when we're feeling safe versus when we're feeling threatened. Now, I was at an acceptance and commitment therapy seminar once, and they used an example of a bunny rabbit and had you imagine a bunny rabbit in a field, and it's just kind of like having a good time and nibbling on different plants, and maybe it works on his burrow a little bit or sniffs and figures out what the other bunnies are up to. It has a variety of interests and that sort of thing. But then suddenly it smells the fox, and all of a sudden all the other interests go out the window and everything becomes focused on survival. So that is generally true in trauma for all of us. Our interests focus on what seems necessary to survive. Possibilities become seen in very black and white. That's to aid in sharp decision-making and intense actions. We might feel we need to sacrifice some of our interests and needs to carry out our survival strategy. But in simple situations, like when the fox goes away, the rabbit just kind of shakes it off and goes back to normal. But many situations are much harder to resolve. Now, a classic situation that many children face is that's been called betrayal trauma. And that's like where they're relying for support on the very person that hurts and abuses them. So naturally they want to get away from the abuser, but at the same time, they need to turn towards that person for support and care. And that this leads to internal conflict and also shame because the person recognizes they're choosing to do things like turn towards the very person that hurts them. Another classic situation that involves a split inside a person is just simply when part of the person wants to forget a trauma that happened and get on with everyday life, but another part of them wants to remember and focus on the trauma so that they can deal with it and prevent it from reoccurring. And often people will be dominating their lives by the part of them that wants to forget the trauma, while the second part that wants to remember it will just emerge in stuff like flashbacks. So the origin of dissociative splits is often the conflict between two or more strategies, each of which seems necessary for survival. Each strategy seems to depend on excluding the other. In other words, if you want to get on with daily life, you think you need to push away the memories of the trauma. And if you want to focus on the trauma to keep it from happening again, you need to quit focusing on everyday life and really focus on the trauma. So instead of integration, the person feels torn as one side and then the other vies for control. And I believe this plays a key dynamic in a lot of mental disorders, including psychosis. Generally, in people with psychosis, it's been found that the more severe any aspects of childhood trauma are, the more severe are the dissociative symptoms. And greater dissociation has been associated with a wide variety of psychotic symptoms. It's linked to hallucinations across multiple sensory modalities. There's large associations with paranoia and delusions, significant link with symptoms of disorganization or the somewhat smaller magnitude. Now, dissociation was not consistently linked to negative symptoms. And one of the thoughts there is maybe that negative symptoms may come out of coping strategies, alternative to dissociation, where there's just a general downregulation of emotion and social engagement. One way to think about this is it's a really crude model of some people's minds, but in normal experience, we might say something like this is going on. Our conscious awareness, that which one consciously identifies with, is influenced not just by the external world, but by all sorts of stuff that gets going within us. So, we might just find ourselves spontaneously imagining something or having an impulse or an emotion wells up or a memory occurs to us or a thought pops into our head or we have an internal representation of our boss and what our boss might say, or we just have an inner voice that's speaking about something. So that's just kind of like normal human functioning. Now, if you've been traumatized, this can all become more difficult, because it might be the trauma memory that's starting to come in there, an emotion associated with the trauma, or an impulse to flee a situation that is a result of the trauma, let's say. And if the person's been pushing that kind of stuff away and not integrating it, then that can seem really threatening. And it can be very intrusive and disruptive, but this is all not seen as psychotic as long as the connection with the trauma is clear. The person is aware they're pushing away a trauma memory. But when we see people, caught up in, what we can call psychosis, where people might really not want to see various parts of their experiences as belonging to them, and they may conceptualize things very differently. So they have this idea of how they think they should be thinking or feeling, and then the stuff intrudes into their mind they see as coming from outside of them, outside of their mind. And that's, part of the confusion of the boundary between inside and outside that plays a key role in psychosis. So they might think, well, that's the alien sending me those thoughts, or telepathy, or the brain implant is making me feel that emotion, or Satan is tempting me with that impulse, or it's witchcraft, or just a voice that isn't part of me. Now they come into the mental health system, which comes up with another interpretation. And a map like this, like, hey, that's not, that's not the aliens, that's not witchcraft, that's your mental illness or your chemical imbalance or your misfiring synapses, or hey, you just have a neurological brain disease that's making you have those experiences, or just your symptoms. Now, can anybody see anything that's likely to go wrong for a person if they accept this map of the experience? Maybe people can just type something in the chat. Jennifer, you can tell me what they're typing in. Anything that might go wrong if people are looking at their experience this way, that the mental health professionals might be promoting?
Feeling noted of feeling broken, being perceived as being broken, that there's no cure.
Yeah, it's sort of like you're inhabited now by an illness, and inside you feel, there's no cure. You just got this stuff inside you, and what can you do about it? And so I think part of forming good human connections and centering human connections is being slow to assume that people are categorically different from us and noticing the commonalities. So in CBT for psychosis, for example, and we call it normalizing when we look at how a person's tricky experience might just be a variation or perhaps an extreme variation on everyday human experiences. Now, our minds are kind of like all weird and have strange stuff that pops up in them. And they seem even stranger when people use different words to describe what's going on, even though what they're describing might be an experience or a dynamic that we all have at some time. Now, when I teach seminars, I often ask people if they've ever had something like a separate spirit or demon inside them that tried to take them over and make them do something that they didn't want to do. Usually almost nobody says they had an experience like that. And that's understandable because the notion that something might be trying to take over our mind and make us do things we don't want to do has been classified as a bizarre delusion. But then I ask people, well, how many of you have ever done something like try to go on a diet only then to experience something inside you try to take you over and make you eat a piece of chocolate cake? Now, most people raise their hand. Then I point out it's really the same dynamic. We had decided, we were a person who didn't want to eat cake and we wanted to get healthy instead. But really, we were more complex than that. So part of us manifested as this impulse to, eat the cake despite our intention not to. Now, a big problem with psychosis can be that both the person being treated and the professionals treating them don't want to deal with all of the person's internal complexity. The person themselves might not want to deal with their split off parts, so they see it as something external to themselves and try to suppress or ignore them. And the professionals also don't want to deal with those parts either as being parts of the person. So they just label them as illness and try to suppress them with drugs or get the person to forget them. And both really just want to treat the conscious identity of the person as the real person, and just relate to that part and then try to suppress or ignore the tricky parts that are causing trouble, because we have this idea that people should be simpler than that. But in reality, like I was saying, we all are more complex and we can all have conflicts inside. Think back to the last time when part of you was angry and wanted to speak out about something, while another part of you just wanted to shut up and not cause any trouble. But when people have had trauma or other kinds of major confusion in their lives, these divisions may be many times more entrenched and more difficult. But relating to people fully, I think, means being open to seeing the humanity in all the parts of people and in their reactions, rather than being too sure we know what's pathology. And we can also be open to the variety of ways that different cultural groups make sense of their experience. For example, in some groups, it's common to have your ancestors talk to you in your mind. Now, Louis Malmadrona is a Native American psychiatrist I know, but he said it wasn't until he went to medical school that he found out that most people don't hear voices like the voices of their ancestors. And furthermore, that it's considered a bad thing to hear them. We've never heard of that before. So instead of insisting that the person come back to our version of normal, we can again be less certain about exactly what health is, and instead kind of like collaboratively explore with them to find a way for them to get to something that works for them. So, for example, if a person is being terrorized by Satan, we might not have to convince them that it's not Satan. After all, there's a lot of people getting by perfectly well in life that believe in Satan, right? And that Satan talks to you. But instead, we might get curious about how others in their social group that believe in Satan manage to avoid being terrorized by him. And if we can help the person not be terrorized by Satan, then maybe they can get on with their lives. So that's still normalizing in a way. It's helping the person find a way to accept their experience and feel they can cope with it. It's about changing their relationship with the experience, not getting rid of it. Though it is also true that some experiences do fade once we change how we relate to them. Now, unfortunately, though, especially when we think we know for certain that what experience is really nothing but mental illness, the focus tends to go towards getting rid of the experiences. But that's really one-sided, and it tends to backfire. Trying to get rid of experience has been compared with trying to push a beach ball underwater. You can kind of do it, but then it comes back out with more force when you let go. So instead, what tends to happen is something like this. We have the disturbing emotion or thought or voice. We might frame it as not belonging, as illness. Let's get rid of it. So try to get rid of it, but the efforts to get rid of it often make it more disturbed and disturbing. And then, of course, we get upset about, look how bad it is. It's even getting worse. And then maybe frame that as a worsening of the illness and try even harder to suppress it. And of course, it gets even more disturbing. It's a vicious circle. I mentioned Eleanor Longden earlier, and many of you know she's now a prominent researcher, but earlier in her life, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And she noted that she was abused as a kid, and she tried to bury the experience inside her mind. But the problem, as she put it later, was she buried it alive. And then it came back in the form of voices. And then the professionals tried to get rid of the voices and tried to encourage her to get rid of them. But that ended up being more attempting to bury them alive, and it didn't work. And the voices just got annoyed and got worse. Fortunately, she learned a different approach to the hearing voices movement, which says that voices should not be considered the problem. And if there's trouble with voices, the key thing is to change the relationship with them. And it was changing the relationship with them that allowed her to heal. So kind of what I'm suggesting is that there's basically three different approaches to psychosis or confusing altered states of mind. And the first one is just to let them take over and drive the person's life. Like the slide says, that can lead to a lot of trouble. The second is to see the altered states as an enemy and try to suppress them at almost any cost. And the mental health system very often takes the second approach. And diagnosed people might sometimes be letting the altered state take over and sometimes seeing it as the enemy and fighting it. But I think it's the third approach that's more likely to work. And that's kind of like working on integrating the altered state with discernment, making peace with it, and maybe even looking at maybe there's some possible value in the altered state, but you also have to avoid its excesses. So that involves being more uncertain about what's healthy or not, but then trying to figure out together, dialogue about it. So you might not know, is the problem that the person is listening too much to voices and internal stimuli? Or maybe is it sometimes they're not listening enough or not listening in the right way, and there's important messages they've been tuning out. Very often it just might seem obvious to us that a voice or an intrusive belief or something is dangerous and unhelpful. So one way of trying to make peace within a person is that championed by the acceptance and commitment therapy approach. basically just accept that there's parts of our mind that are pushy and unreasonable, and just bring our focus back to heading in our preferred direction in life. And they use the metaphor of disruptive passengers on a vehicle, and they point out that, well, trying to get them to shut up doesn't work, trying to kick them off the bus doesn't work, trying to appease them doesn't work. And instead, they suggest just accept the passengers are present and focus on driving where you want to drive. And I find that helpful, that metaphor helpful up to a point, but also a bit incomplete. And it makes me think of a line from the film Thanks for Sharing. And in that film, there was a statement was made that feelings are like children. It doesn't work to let them drive the car, but it also doesn't work to lock them in the trunk. So, we definitely don't want to let, all the rowdy parts of ourselves, drive our life. And sometimes it is important that we just ignore what's going on with them while we, focus on going in an important direction. But I think just like when you have kids in a car, that same thing is true. But it also pays to be curious with what's going on with them and what their underlying concerns are. Because after all, if they're part of us, why not, pay attention to what they might reveal? And it might be like working with kids, your kid's demanding a cookie. Maybe what they really need isn't a cookie, they need a nap or whatever, but you get curious, you pay attention. So that idea that we need to look behind a scary voice or an apparently fixed belief to see what might be behind it. In compassion focused therapy, Charlie Harriot Maitland is somebody I know teaches that. And I borrowed this slide from him, and he borrows this idea from the Wizard of Oz, where Dorothy and the crew finally get to meet the wizard, and they come into this room and they just see a big face in the wall and hear a really scary, intimidating voice. But then Toto, Dorothy's dog, pulls back a curtain and there's a little guy pulling levers. And of course, the voice booms out, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. But of course, that's exactly what they need to pay attention to, because that's where everything is coming from. And this getting curious about what's behind a voice can be a really productive thing. And we can be curious about it, and we can teach people to be curious about it, and to approach their own experience in a compassionate and curious way. I was at a workshop about a year ago, and the presenters brought in a guy named Mick to share about his experience. And he related that he started hearing voices when he was a teen, and then he was treated with a standard mental health treatment aimed at suppressing his voices for about 50 years. And it didn't work very well. It was an ongoing struggle. The worst voice he struggled with seemed to be a kind of demon. When it spoke, it usually seemed to be behind him, but sometimes it would come around to the front. He'd catch the glimpse of it, and it looked horrific. And in one way, it would terrorize him as he'd be out on the street, and a bus or truck would come by, and it would give him terrible images of himself being thrown under the bus's wheels and crushed. But then after 50 years, he met people who encouraged him to begin getting curious about the voice and trying to dialogue with it in a curious and compassionate way. And everything changed. The voice eventually admitted to him to being a part of him that was just 8 years old. Now, you might wonder, why did the voice come across as so horrific? And he wondered that too. So he asked the voice, and it explained, well, if I hadn't seemed ominous and scary, you wouldn't have listened to me. You wouldn't have paid attention. And we could say that maybe Mick hadn't been in the habit of listening to his inner child, so he needed to act up to get some attention. Mick also wondered what the bit about the voice about the buses and trucks was. And the voice admitted that it was scared of big vehicles. So it was trying to make sure Mick was scared too by giving him those terrible images. So anyway, now they have a good relationship, and the voice calls Mick Dad, and it's not really a problematic voice anymore. He still doesn't have to set limits with it, just like you would with an 8-year-old. So anyway, I would suggest that we take an approach to mental problems that's more like that described in this slide. Like instead of seeing our role is to eliminate symptoms of mental illness. It's to mediate the conflicts that might be going on inside the person. And without being too certain that one side of the conflict is the correct side or is the real person, with the other side being the symptoms. Problem is, when the goal is seen as eliminating symptoms, there's a good chance the helper is going to take sides with one part of the person's process and try to suppress the other side.
Here we go.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Was I going very long, or did I
Oh,
just
no,
disappear from the...
just a moment, just a moment. It just froze a bit and now you're back.
All right. Sorry about that.
That happens.
Yeah, I can. Okay. So yeah, um so working towards balance, like it's often really important to set limits with intrusive or disturbing or polarized parts of the person. Like especially like if a part is pushing for suicide, it's really important the person become able to stand up to that and not be pushed into terrible actions. But at the same time, we can also be open to hearing about and addressing the underlying concern that those parts represent. And that's the step that won't often be taken if we're sure that the disturbing part is just a symptom of an illness. So having this kind of balance requires a skill of being assertive, but in a friendly and curious way. And that's a skill that usually when people are having trouble relating to their internal parts or voices in this kind of way, they also have the same problem in relating to external people in that kind of way. So we want to be able to help people have relationships where they can be kind of like open to others, but also being able to hold their own truth in the face of pressure to change. And we can facilitate that by having a relationship with them where they feel safe to both accept input from us, but also to reject that input when it doesn't really fit for them. And that's different than the idea that we should be aiming at people becoming, compliant or submissive to whatever the professionals decide is best for them, which in some corners of the mental health, that's, compliance is seen as a really important thing. Instead, working from the foundation of a healthy relationship with the person, we can also help them imagine or role play or eventually engage in healthy, assertive, and curious dialogues and relationships with both external people and with the parts of themselves. And so they can be open to getting, helpful ideas from others, but also reject what doesn't work for them. And this is tricky, and sometimes we might not be getting it right. But if our aim is balance, we're likely to be able to correct it if we go too far one way or the other. So a key thing in balancing is not taking any person or side or part of a person as being completely correct. But just finding some value in it and seeing it as belonging and maybe holding part of a complex truth. And we can do that best when our own mind is balanced. This slide presents what is thought to be the qualities of a balanced mind as proposed by the internal family systems or IFS model. And they like to use a lot of C words to make it a little easier for you to remember them. Compassionate, creative, clear, connected, courageous, confident, calm, curious. Now, I really focus most on the curious and compassionate ones. I think that, and that's very similar to what's proposed in compassion-focused therapy, if some of you are familiar with that. And so the idea is that the helper or the therapist should try to access this state of mind within themselves and then relate to the client from that state of mind. But then also, it's about helping the client access that state of mind for themselves. And then from that state of mind, they can work on relating to the parts of themselves that have been disturbing them. So even if they've had an anxious part, instead of like just trying to get rid of the anxiety or letting the anxiety take them over, it's turning towards the anxiety as you might turn towards an anxious child. And, oh, seem anxious. What are you anxious about? Not necessarily believing that the fear is something big, but being curious and open and kind and, reassuring towards the anxious part of themselves. Um, so I like this model because it both highlights the importance of the relationship between the helper and the person that's struggling, but it also gives a central role to the person themselves. Because the idea is that they can learn to have a compassionate self or access their compassionate self, and then also relate to the stuff that's going on inside them from that point of view of compassion. Um, I also like the peer aspect of compassion. Perma Chodron was quoted as saying that compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness can we be present with the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity. Now, in contrast to the frozen stories of mental illness, when people have certainty about it, I'm just mentally ill or you're just mentally ill. When we approach people in this kind of like compassionate way, and people learn to approach themselves in that compassionate way, they find and they find their shared humanity, and we help, we create that sense of shared humanity. Then people become like a human whose story can change. And I think that's really important. And I really like this Salman Rushdie quote. Those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless. So stories are all about relationships. Stories are the way we kind of in a way build our sense of self out of stories. And mental problems are disturbed relationships. As we refashion our story, we change those relationships. We find we have a freedom to become a healthier version of ourselves and to envision new ways of engaging our community. Now, trying to change our story is a really beautiful and powerful thing, but it's also possible for people to get a little carried away with it. And it's interesting that going psychotic or going mad is often described as losing the plot of the story. I think it's often not appreciated how much becoming psychotic can mean rejecting the plot, rejecting meanings that have been given to things before the psychosis. I think it can be a very clumsy and radical attempt to change the story. And that was certainly the case for me. I mentioned earlier that, I was traumatized as a young person. And from all that trauma, I had a very clear sense of myself as a defective person. But then I completely rejected the idea that I was the person that experienced all that. I was just someone new that was coming into being, and this realizations that I was having. And even the idea that things or events had some kind of definite meaning, or that the idea that common people were in touch with reality, I just was rejecting all of that. I had to kind of like blow up my story, I felt, to create room for something new. But of course, when we blow up our story and all sense of meaning and all that, it's very dangerous to be without a coherent story. And then that sense of being without a coherent story means we might grab on to a new story that might be defective. Um, I know Paul Lysaker once asked one of his clients why he was believing something that didn't seem to make any sense. And the client said, well, believing that keeps the vacuum from destroying my mind or something like that. So we're often trained to think of schizophrenia as a loss of a stable sense of self and world. And we're often trying to imagine it as being caused by the illness that we imagine that schizophrenia is. So it's the illness that makes people lose their sense of the self and stable world. But a more person-centered way of understanding it may be that there's a story to this loss. Like with me, my early life, the problem was the trauma and the problematic meanings I had drawn from the trauma had polluted my sense of self and my sense of the world. And it made me want to escape, even if that was by blowing everything up. So there's some kind of striving behind the psychosis. And that also relates to how the breakdown of the mind and older ways of making meaning can be part of a creative process, because it can lead to a breakthrough if things turn out right and that the person can work their way to a better sense of meaning. Now, unfortunately, instead of working their way to a better sense of meaning, people often just end up kind of panicking and grabbing onto rigid beliefs, which then becomes just more part of the psychosis. Now, one thing I've observed is that whatever psychosis seems to be, it also at times will, at least at times, will seem to be the opposite of that, or be the opposite of that. So sometimes you see people really loosening up how they think and losing their pre-existing sense of meaning. While at other times you see people grasping onto ideas in a really rigid way. So the problem is that when one extreme doesn't work, people often flip to the opposite, and then that often doesn't work either. So people can get stuck in this states of confusion. But if we're connecting with people in a very human way and helping them see not only the extremes, but also possible ways of balancing between the extremes, and that they can keep experimenting till they find stories that work for them and that stories that allow us to relate well with each other, then people, I think, can rebuild their sense of self and world and maybe, have it turn out better than where they started. Because I think that's eventually what worked for me and other people that I know that have made good, recoveries from states of confusion. So I want to kind of finish up by showing you a couple slides put together by my colleague Louis Malmadrona, remember the Native American psychiatrist. He's and kind of an expert in person-centered approaches and how they relate to stories. So one of the things he likes to emphasize is kind of like in his tradition that there's no bad people, there's only bad stories. He was actually talking today at the conference, and he was talking about one idea is we're just this kind of like collection of stories around us, the stories that have been told about us, the stories that we've told, and that we but if a lot of those are bad stories that can lead us to doing bad things, that can lead us to have bad ways of understanding ourselves and that sort of thing. But, bad stories can be replaced by good stories. And so the more people tell and hear good stories, the more likely they are to stick and have an impact. And miracles are always possible. So we mustn't succumb to the story that we're hopeless. Hope. There's always a possibility of coming up with a new stories, as long as we're curious. Like somebody else was saying in the conference that I was attending today, that curiosity can produce miracles because it gets us looking at things in new ways and starting out in new ways. People's troubles might have emerged out of some of the bad stories they grew up in and with, but we can help them change and replace their stories with something more life affirming. Um, and so Lewis would also really focus on how the new stories that the person's learning then have to be lived out within community. And that's what makes them real, makes them, able to replace those old stories of suffering, isolation, and woe. But so that's one thing. At first, it's in our relationship, our helping relationship with them. Maybe a new story starts to form, but then we can kind of coach people and going out and trying things and finding a community where they can relate and live out those new stories. And by the way, sometimes what people have to replace is sometimes people with psychosis have grandiose stories, but it's the same kind of thing. I mean, I was often when I was getting rid of my stories of suffering and woe, I tried to come with stories that, made me kind of really grand or above other people. And those stories were also really flawed. They didn't work. But eventually could find better stories. So if we can engage with people in ways that respect them, that share power instead of overpowering them, then we can help people create new stories of connection and meaning, which then they can go and live out in their community as just described on the slide. And actually that's helping the stuff they can live out both within their external community and within their internal community, because we all have kind of an internal community inside of ourselves. So we want to be able to relate differently with the people in our lives and also with the parts of ourselves. Yeah, thanks for listening. And now I want to hear a little from you, like what some of your, questions are, what might help you understand some of this a little better. And yeah.
Ron, thank you so much. That was terrific. And yes, we do have some questions for you. Boy, we've got a lot. We had a lot of great comments, by the way. So I really feel like people were touched by what you had to share. The first one I want to start out with is, how do you help a person distinguish between spirituality and symptoms of psychosis?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like some people have really tried to do this as a clear distinction, but I'm kind of like in the same boat with Louis Malmadrona. And I would say that there's not a clear distinction other than with spirituality, it's going well and is being managed well. People aren't losing their balance. They're able to kind of like move through it. And he talks about how in the Native community they do a lot of things to prepare people for ceremony, for spiritual ceremony, and they do things to keep them safe through it. And often with psychosis, what we see is people going into something really unprepared and being very wild about it. Like I talked about with me, it was kind of like blowing up all my original ideas of what things meant and getting lost and confused. Another way of looking at it, I've used the metaphor as like the wilderness. Mm-hmm. And it's like there's a big difference between, going out on a wonderful wilderness tour where you see all the glory of the wilderness and one where you go out unprepared and in a very disastrous situation and need rescue. So there's no black and white distinction, I think, between spirituality and psychosis, but psychosis is more getting lost in the terrain. There's a famous Joseph Campbell quote about how the psychotic drowns in the same sea that the mystic swims with delight, or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's very good. I appreciate, this is another good one here that's just popped up too, is what if someone is continuing to experience trauma? How does that change your approach?
Yeah, I mean, if they're continuing to experience trauma, obviously, if you possibly can, help them get to somewhere where they're not being traumatized anymore. Unfortunately, when we have a really dysfunctional system, like where people are stuck being homeless and then kind of like traumatized over and over, people are stealing their stuff or they're subject to abuse on the street, it's really difficult. So, I mean, you might try to help people manage what's going on better. But obviously, if you can do something that helps end the trauma, that's really helpful, because that, yeah, it's otherwise it's, really, really very difficult.
Very good. Yeah, it's very good. Folks were asking when you started out your conversation, and I wanted to just return to it. Some folks were curious about, when we're looking at psychosis, have we looked at it only as trauma, or have we ruled out heredity as being an issue? So maybe just exploring that a little bit for folks.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think it's, there's, I mean, even with PTSD, there's evidence that some people are more genetically prone to get PTSD, but obviously you need the trauma as well. Um, there's a lot said that, I mean, a lot of people have been told, well, because you have psychosis, that means you must have had a genetic predisposition. And I think that's as foolish as telling somebody, well, because you had a heart attack, you must have had a genetic predisposition to a heart attack. I mean, you might have, but we don't really know that unless we can say, hey, you've got X gene and we've proven that that makes you more vulnerable. So at most, I think we should say, hey, it might be that you're a little more genetically vulnerable. I mean, there's all sorts of things I think that can create a vulnerability to psychosis. I mean, some of them aren't trauma. They might just be, let's say, somehow the person learned to cope by being perfectionistic, but that made them kind of rigid. And now they're actually more vulnerable to something that throws a wrench in their perfectionism. I mean, John Nash and the story, A Beautiful Mind, was about him. And one of his problems, he was trying to be the top mathematician in the world. And I think he was only number 3 or something like that. But he got himself all worked up into a big state of stress that I'm sure contributed to the psychosis. So it's complex. I'm not trying to say that everybody with psychosis has something we would recognize as trauma. Of course, everyone has difficulties in life. Life is tricky and difficult for everyone, even people that grow up without what we think of as trauma.
Yeah, that's well said. Very well said. But it's interesting too, and as you're talking again, I'm getting other pings from folks. So it's really just want you to know that's generating people's ideas and thoughts. So I want you to know that I appreciate your responses. We have a question. What is your best tip for clinical providers who are bringing lived experience professionals or peer supporters onto their team for the first time?
Oh, that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
I guess it depends on kind of like where your team is at, because I've seen, some teams where it's pretty smooth and easy to it, and they're just kind of like they're already pretty humanistic. It can be really challenging if you have, like I know our local county mental health department for a while was really pretty rigid in its distinctions between the clinicians and those that they were treating. And when they first tried hiring our peer support specialists, it was really a disaster because, they, even, hey, can this person use the staff bathroom? It's like really bad. So that's it. So it helps anyway if there's more than one of you. That, of course, but often there maybe just is one of you. I think like what I did when I was going, I didn't share my lived experience until I had proven that I could do the work, and then it was kind of like, hey, they already know me. They already know that I'm not going to suddenly blow apart. Now maybe I can share that, hey, maybe there's more to my experience, and then they can be more open-minded. So that's definitely one thing, is go undercover a little bit first and prove yourself, and then come out. That might help.
No, I appreciate that. I mean, we definitely want to continue to be integrating our peer supporters and our lived experience in all aspects of the work we're doing. So I appreciate that. That was a great question. We have gotten a number of comments about differences between transgenerational trauma, complex trauma versus like one traumatic event. So the question would be, is how do you think about transgenerational trauma versus then one particular type of event?
Yeah, I mean, well, and of course, there's obviously, maybe it's not intergenerational, but there's been multiple traumas in the same person's life. But intergenerational trauma, yeah, it's a big thing. We don't fully understand how it manifests. But yeah, there was one woman at the conference just today was talking about her family and how, like, when, you know, she was just still inside her mother. Her mother was fleeing fleeing the Cultural Revolution in China, and undergoing pretty extreme trauma, torn away from her family. And then, of course, that was, the effect on the family of that disruption. And then I think it makes everything just kind of like have an edge to it. Or like, I know one guy whose uncle was a Holocaust survivor, and he said just being around that uncle was just stressful. And the uncle would sometimes do things like they'd go to sit down, and the uncle would pull the chair out from under him and just to kind of like show them that life was unpredictable and to be ready. So there was that hypervigilance was just being communicated. And then there's talk about epigenetics that might be, creating more stress that way too. We don't fully understand how that, but just, I think, you can look at, that it helps some people just to recognize, hey, that might have been going on in my family. That might be what's put me on edge, and then that I, need to, that's why it's harder for me than some of my peers to feel safe and relaxed. Or it might be that the person identifies specific things they've been taught in their family, probably as a result of the intergenerational trauma, that then they have to unlearn. Maybe those things aren't always true. Like, maybe you don't have to always be on edge, and that it is okay to relax some of the time. So it's definitely there's people that can give whole talks and books and whatnot on intergenerational trauma. I'm not really an expert on it.
No, I think that was a really lovely response, and it really speaks back to how you discuss being curious, and how that curiosity then leads to awareness and maybe understanding that. So I think your answer was lovely in terms of how that pulls all those aspects together, because that was really something that spoke really clearly to me while you were speaking, is having that permission to stop, be curious, look, not be afraid, but not judge it, not have that stigma, but just kind of peek at it. And I feel like you answered that question lovely, using that framework. Oh my goodness. We've had so many other good ones here. So Ron, if you see me look away, I'm looking at the screen.
Oh, that's fine.
So you're like, what is that? What is she doing? All right, a couple of things. Folks have really talked about how just really appreciating your perspective and being so humanistic and really centering human connection. Do you find that explaining the relationship between psychosis and trauma can be destigmatizing?
I think it can definitely be destigmatizing, and there's actually even research on that. And also when other people in the person's life consider that trauma might be a factor, that's less stigmatizing. I mean, there's research that when you teach people in the general public that somebody's mental problems are the result of something wrong with their brain, it makes people see the person as more dangerous and want more distance from them. And it's basically, they start thinking, this isn't really a person I can relate to. This is just somebody with their brains getting scrambled by something. I want to pull back. I don't want to deal with it. But if you tell them, hey, this person may be suffering because of confusing, weird things that happen to them, then it's like, oh, maybe that makes some sense. Maybe I can relate to this person. I'd also like to say that when I was going through, altered states and stuff, that the most scary thought to me was that I was going to get pigeonholed as somebody who was just mentally ill and not worth listening to or relating to. It was just really, really scary. And so it's the loss of a possibility, that human connection, is really terrifying.
Oh, that's really powerful. That loss of a possibility. That was well said. Yes, thank you. Someone also asked about kind of ruling out medications. How do you think about the role of medications in person-centered services?
I think it's important to make it more collaborative. I mean, we could give long talks just on what's known and not known about medications. I'm more a fan of what some have called slow psychiatry, which is when we're slow to propose medications, where we start with smaller doses, we're willing to see, well, maybe you don't need that anymore, and we could try weaning off, that kind of approach, but also doing that more collaboratively with people. I think is a better approach, because I mean there are so many different people and so many different situations. You wouldn't want to come up with any kind of one size fits all approach. But I think if you fault the system now, it's often for thinking, oh, this person has psychosis. We know they need this drug and this much, and I think a more tentative approach is better and more collaborative.
I like the way you describe it, but by going slow is to allow for that discourse, that dialogue, again, the curiosity and exploring then the options together. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's see, I'm seeing another one that looks pretty good here too. If you could tell every mental health provider one thing about psychosis, what would it be?
What I think this thing that it might be a reaction to life and not just something gone wrong with the brain. That's I think a real core thing. And we have tricky lives, we have tricky brains. It can be really confusing, and people can spin out and they get caught in, I'm sorry, in vicious circles that they can get stuck in for a whole lifetime sometimes. But it is also stuff that people can learn to make sense of and understand and break out of those vicious circles. And that's what I think our work should be about, trying to do.
It's really beautiful. And I think having you here today, that's such a powerful message then to be passing on to all of us that are here now. I think that's what the space is all about. And we're, just grateful to hear that. And in part, it's very hopeful. Impart that hope. Yes, Tara said it was beautifully said. That was very beautifully said. All right. Well, I'm looking at any other questions here. We might be winding down here on. Let me see others. Bear with me. There was one, I'm not sure, but what do you think of the brain spotting method to identify potential traumas? And I'll tell you what, I'm not sure, I don't know a lot about that. So I'm going to just ask it and see what you have to say. So I'm
I don't know a lot about brain spotting. I've heard about it. I mean, from what I've heard, it sounds like a lot of therapies work. I mean, there's so many different therapies, and often, one doesn't work super better than another. One thing I could say is that I'm just talking about working with trauma therapies generally in psychosis. Like, a lot of people have been afraid to do that. They've been afraid, well, here you get this person that's already, going through confusion and all that. And if we try to look at their traumas, that'll just destabilize them. Now, certainly people can use some support and getting a little more stable as they start to do trauma work and all that. But they have done research where they tried using things like exposure therapy or EMDR with people that had both trauma and psychosis, and they found that it was helpful, and that even in people, sometimes when they started the therapy, the people seemed to get a bit more unstable. But even those people that got a little more unstable in the beginning of therapy, by the end of therapy, they were doing just as well as the others. So it didn't seem like it had a permanently bad effect. So I think it would really help if we became less scared of facing trauma. And by the way, that's somewhere where, there's something called parallel process, where often the client is doing something and the system starts doing it too. And often the people that we work with are afraid to face their trauma. Like, there was one, young man, I was early in my work with psychosis and trauma. He, didn't even remember his trauma at all. It was his family that reported he had all this trauma. He didn't remember it. But he felt he was being persecuted by the government. And at some point I introduced the idea, well, maybe when you start feeling the government is persecuting you, what's really happening is you're having some kind of flashback or starting to remember some of this stuff, maybe just with an emotional memory and all that. And at first he thought that was way worse than the idea that the government was persecuting him,
Oh, wow.
because in a way it was easier for him to think it was the government than, because he kind of like, part of him knew that he was keeping these horrible memories at bay, right? And so, but eventually he came around, and he was able to work with it as trauma and face what happened, and that was helpful. So
Yeah, that was powerful for sure. Oh my goodness. Well, Ron, I know we're nearing the end of time, so maybe one more question. So, we're thinking about connections not only individually but within community. What do you think is important for helping our communities to be inclusive and understanding of psychosis?
yeah, I do think that one thing is just, starting to be more honest about how psychosis can be a reaction to life. Because again, I was saying that makes people in the community more willing to relate to the person. And when they think of it as just, oh, that's just some biological illness, like their psychiatrists deal with it. Hey, are you taking your meds? There's not much relationship. But when people realize, hey, life is tricky and distressing often, and this person may be reacting to it, then maybe we can, as a community, come together and help them. I mean, Louis Malmadrona, he was just saying today that people with psychosis are often like the canaries in the coal mine. They're more sensitive in some ways than others. But when people are aware of that, then they're more aware of like, hey, maybe it's important to relate to these people and understand what they're going through and help them heal. And in some ways, that's maybe going to help our whole society. So that's one way of looking at it.
Oh, wow. That's great. That really, what a beautiful way to end your presentation, Ron. And actually, Tina has put a note. It says your positivity and hope for a better life is a breath of fresh air. So she just wanted to pull that forward for you, because that's what your presentation has been for us today, Ron. Just outstanding. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate you.
All right. Yeah, and I'd just like to say that I do offer other trainings, and if you want to find, you can email me. My email is like the numeral 4 and then my name, Ron Unger, RONUNGER @gmail.com, and ask to get on my list, or just go to my blog and you can, look around and see on the menu there's training and therapy for psychosis. So yeah, if you want to hear more.
Oh, wonderful. And for folks here in attendance, again, we have 700 people here, know that we'll share Ron's contact information in his presentation as well. And you may even be seeing it in the chat as we're speaking now. But for sure, we'll pass that along, Ron, because folks have been impacted by your presentation. We really appreciate you.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate that you've made this opportunity available, and thanks for all your hard work. That's a lot of work to put on a conference like this.
Oh, you're welcome. You've made it richer. So